This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and graphic design. I'm Nick Manise. On today's program, graphic designer Vince Frost reflects on 3 decades of practice. Japan's carpentry culture is front and centre at a new exhibition in London. Plus, Mirkku Kullberg, CEO of Swedish rug company Kasthall. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. Vince Frost is the founder, CEO and executive director of Frost Collective. After becoming the youngest associate director at globally renowned design consultancy Pentagram, he started his own studio in London in 1994. Key projects since that time have included branding work for Sydney Airport and Australia's Special Broadcasting Service, and initiatives for the likes of Greater Sydney Parklands and the Qantas headquarters. Yes, if you hadn't guessed it, he moved to Australia. In our conversation, we reflected on moving between Sydney and London, but Vince started by musing on the initial days of launching his own firm.
Well, I just kind of decided to leave Pentagram after being made an associate partner because I realized that I had to go out in the world and get work. I learned a lot at Pentagram about design, but I didn't learn a huge amount about the business of design. And that's something where I started Frost in November 94, and I remember just sitting there at my desk. I had a desk and I had a landline. No computers then, I don't think. And I was just waiting for the phone to ring, weirdly, naively. And of course, it didn't ring. And it didn't ring for weeks. Nobody knew I was in existence. And so I just really focused on getting out there, meeting people, connecting with people, and trying to find opportunities. I had previously done Big Magazine, which was a A3 Spanish publication, photographic publication, and I'd used a lot of letterpress in that. I had won awards and got some attention, and so that at least was out there in the world, starting to kind of create some kind of reputation for me. So things did begin to trickle in, but it was pretty scary in the beginning.
Maybe let's jump to your decision after more or less 10 years in practice to shift your operations to Sydney. You're already jumping back and forth, I understand.
Yeah.
What's it like for a company that was so well established in London to then be like, you know what, we're moving our HQ completely?
Yeah, well, it wasn't really the moving the HQ. It was really more that I moved. When I started my business in 94, I also met my ex-wife, Sonia, who was from Melbourne. I had never even thought about Australia apart from kangaroos and koala bears and cliche things. Meeting her opened up my world to Australia. I remember going there for the first time and going, oh my God, this place is phenomenal. Over the 10 years, from 94 to 2003, every year we went to Australia, and I guess I started networking and meeting people.
Planning for retirement.
Yeah, exactly. But still it's still 10 years, it's still early on in a business. We were working for the Serpentine Gallery, Wapping Project, doing lots of books and magazines and things like that. We weren't of the scale that we are today, but obviously my ambition was to continue to grow. So when we went to Australia, I basically kind of ended up merging my business with another business that was there called Emery Vincent, and working alongside a guy called Gary Emery, who was kind of like a big name in Australia for 50 years prior. And so that really helped connect with the Australian design landscape. I had an exhibition at the Opera House in 2006, which was an incredible honor. The exhibition was about demystifying design and design processing and things like that. There's about 60,000 people had gone through the exhibition, and that really helped towards establishing Frost as a brand in Australia. I kept the London studio going. It was a young team, kept that going for a couple of years. I was working all day in Sydney into the night in London, and it was really, really hard, and I had to shut it down, London, sadly, in about 2008, I think it was.
But we're going to come back to that. There's a happy reunion down the line. Just for our listeners, not to bum people out. We're coming back to that. But you mentioned something fascinating there about this exhibition at the Opera House and, you know, establishing Frost as a brand. But I think, is there also a discussion to be had about connecting with people that maybe are beyond design? Like you're bringing people in that aren't designers.
Yeah.
You're talking to them. Published a couple of books. I've got one of them called Design Your Life. You've got these mediums of talking with people that maybe aren't necessarily going to be your clients. Why is that important to your work?
I used to show my mum a book or a magazine or something that I've done, and she would say, oh, I love that. I love the photography. I love the paper. You know, and in the end she'd say, well, what did you do? And I remember that thinking, wow, I take it for granted. It's interesting how the general public just pick up a magazine and see it as a magazine. Pick up a newspaper and read it as a newspaper, not even think this is a newspaper and what went into it. And I think it's what goes into it is really incredible. The effort, the people that are involved in it, the discussions, the options, the trial and error, the craft of making things and that collaborative aspect of co-creation is really, really interesting. And I think I just love the idea of the public understanding what goes into something.
Is that, we're making the focus here on business. Is that also good for business in that when maybe somebody does come along to commission you, they understand the depth of work required to deliver a beautiful product?
I think so. And I think that in the world, I think things are getting more and more competitive. And especially with like AI is going to be, contributing to that as well, helping us, but also possibly contributing to being a competitive aspect in our businesses going forward. It's a competitive market. It always has been. And there's times when it feels more and more competitive, where there's a war, pandemic, or there's a GFC or something that's happening in the world. That makes it harder, but that's when you have to work harder at getting those opportunities. When I did a lot of an analysis around what are we as a business, why are we in business, why am I personally in business, it came back to ultimately helping people. Like, that's not design necessarily, or what you'd expect from a designer to say, but actually, ultimately, I believe that we can help people in a whole bunch of different ways. You can meet with anybody, and anybody would need help. That kind of openness, that kind of focusing on trying to do good in the world, it really resonates with people.
You mentioned AI, the evolution of the work that you've had over the past 30 years. I mean, maybe AI is the way to go with this. People are maybe a little bit scared or tentative of it. Is it a tool? Is it a competitor? How does it work? Where do you see that fitting in with the evolution of your practice?
Going to design school, starting work in London and Pentagram, it was all done by hand. We had a black and white photocopier. That was the highest technology we had at that moment in time. And a fax machine, which still, bizarrely, I find that incredible, that machine. The world has changed dramatically. I remember the first computer, and I remember there being D&AD, I think it was, had a massive debate. And I remember Neville Brody being there. And everyone was talking about, oh my God, is this computer going to take over our jobs, take over the world? Some people saying it's just a tool. Some people saying it's a fad. These Apple Macs will go out of existence. Things have changed dramatically. This phone sitting on the table here today is way more powerful than any of my computers I have had previously. And what you can do in the connection and the live streaming, and it's just phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal today. I kind of have two feelings, mixed feelings about AI, because I naturally feel I could see it coming like 5 years ago, thinking, shit, we need to embrace this. We need to get ahead of it. We need to utilize it and do something with it so we can actually destroy the industry ourselves before this destroys us. And some people are going, well, it's just a tool. It's another tool, just like the internet or whatever. And I feel like this time it's different, it's smarter, it's immediate. We're already utilizing it to do things that we pay people to do. It's immediate and it's infinite options. We did a talk back in Sydney on AI at UNSW. There's a series of kind of conversations, creative conversations that I do there. And you had a few experts, and it was just mixed feelings about it. And nobody really seems to understand or know where it's going. But I think that I don't feel comfortable about it.
And then I guess just finally, we're talking about how your business is dealing with that, but your business has also had an evolution in the last couple of years. You've returned to London. I mean, I want to talk a little bit about when you moved to Sydney, you're taking all this skill set and knowledge you've developed over what would have been 20 years in London. Now you're bringing 20 years of Australian experience back. How has your London-based part of your business changed in the last 20 years?
I've always been going back and forth. We've always been working around the world from Sydney. So I feel like I belong in Sydney, but equally coming back in this last couple of years after COVID, it was quite an adjustment to the city had changed dramatically, economically, but also physically. It had become an incredibly modern city. Somewhere along the line, I missed that. It felt like a building site for a long time, and all of a sudden, wow, modern buildings everywhere, beautiful public places and plazas and greening of the city, which once, when I left, was grey, wet, and old. Like now it's fresh, modern, and there's an energy to it. I'm really excited about London and what it is, its history, and also what it is becoming. I know a lot of people getting a cab here. The taxi drivers are miserable and cynical, and that's always
some things
been like
never
that.
change. Yeah,
no. But riding a bicycle around London has never been safer and cleaner and quicker. And so I see potential in London, being here, connecting with people that we know, and also just all the work that we've been doing in Sydney over the last 20 years, being a far more generalist business than what we were initially here, working a lot in the built environment. So there's that kind of working with architects over the last, I guess, 30 years and working closely on these with developers, etc. The world has changed. The world is being redesigned constantly. And I guess there's that energy in that really concentrated period of time of working with the evolution of Australia. That experience has really led to, you can see that kind of a lot of Australian architects are here and around the world. And you can see that approach to much more outdoor living, even in London. Like London used to be, each building would fill the whole block. Now it's porous. Now it's open. Now there's planting. Still, the focus used to be much more on security and almost like unpenetrable places. And now it's just kind of this generosity that these developers, the engineers, the architects are designing places for people to thrive in, literally. And you see it. You see that energy. Even on a rainy day, which is often, you see that kind of energy flow, which I kind of felt like it wasn't like that before. But those learnings that we've been experiencing over the last 30 years, we've got a team that can work on large-scale projects like this. Even tendering for these projects is not about us. It's actually about us being part of creating something which is intuitive, consistent, whether we're branding a building, putting the wayfinding through a place. It's just really wonderful to see that continuity throughout a place and those experiences that a whole bunch of different people have in a day. And that's something that the whole kind of customer experience is what we focus on. All the different journeys that people are making in their lives under pressure. Could be in a hospital. They're incredibly sad times, incredibly joyful times, and everything in between. You could be a little kid walking around a hospital. What is it like for human beings to experience these places, and how can we design them better?
Vince Frost there. We'll be back in just a moment. We're back, and I'm joined in the studio by this show's producer, Maylee Evans. Maylee, you've told me you've gone to Japan House in London. What were you checking out?
So I've been checking out their newest exhibition, The Craft of Carpentry, drawing life from Japanese forests.
Oh, I like the sound of that. It sounds very calming and soothing.
It really is. And I would highly recommend it, particularly for those who maybe have an interest in woodworking. I think it's an exhibition that does a really good job at contextualising this craft. It can be quite easy to distance a practice from the culture that surrounds it. And I think there's really beautiful ways that they encompass some of the religious aspects of it, and again just the way that a raw material is understood and therefore how that informs the way it's used. You know,
you said if you're into woodworking, that might be a good thing, but it also sounds like if you're not, this is just a beautiful way to understand and maybe appreciate the furniture or the pieces that surround us, even if they're not specifically Japanese. Like, we're talking about the way that things are put together here.
Exactly. On show, you've got a life-size reconstruction of a tea house. So again, it gives you a sense of the scale of some of these crafts in practice. But you've also got a display of 80 tools, and that might sound quite dry. But when you see how specific some of these tools are, there are tools that do one particular job incredibly well, and you see those all sort of lined up on the walls. Another thing which took me by surprise was the templates. They reminded me a bit of fabric patterns, but imagine these out of wood. So you've got lots and lots of templates that would be then used to draft out some of these pieces that would go into a tea house or a shrine or a temple or what have you. Seeing those in person, you get a sense of just how seriously this craft is taken and why something like this deserves the space at Japan House.
I mean, 80 tools on display sounds incredible. This sounds like a sort of dream outing for my dad back in the day. Like, you know, being taken to Bunnings and you're looking at all the B&Q for our British listeners or Lowe's for our US listeners, you know, being taken to a hardware store and kind of seeing everything on display. So we've got the full toolkit here.
You've got the full toolkit, but I will say it's a much more calming and enjoyable experience than perhaps the hardware shop where you're in a massive warehouse. One aspect that I really liked is you get this chance to actually assemble some of the joins. So again, it's something which behind glass, it looks interesting. But when you're actually able to see the intricacy of how some of these joins are made and how secure they are once they're put in place, that's quite incredible.
So you can actually put together the joins?
You can put together the joins. I think also it just means that you get an understanding of just how difficult they must be to craft in the first place. These aren't join together, hope for the best, add a clamp. This is real mastery and real craftsmanship at its highest level.
Maybe I should have taken my dad along to that. That sounds like it would have helped us with our DIY projects. Tell me who you spoke to.
I caught up with Marcelo Nishiyama, so he's a curator for this exhibition, but he also specialises in architectural history and design at the Takanaka Carpentry Tools Museum in Japan. So if anybody is going to know about this. It's Marcelo. I wanted to ask him a bit more about, of course, this carpentry culture, or daiku culture as it's called, but also about the importance of forests, because that was really key. As soon as you go in, there's a section where you can actually smell wood shavings. Again, a very sensory experience. You get a whole array of native trees, and you actually get to experience the subtlety and difference that really beautifully sets the scene for what you encounter downstairs.
So raw material to end product. Let's hear from Marcelo now.
You wanted to know about the role of scent in this exhibition, and the reason I used those scents is because trees all have different personalities, and we all know that, but I feel like it's something we've forgotten. So the scent of the trees is something that helps us to realise the difference between them. And so people who go to that corner of the exhibition, I think British people maybe haven't smelt these scents before, maybe they haven't experienced them before, but they will nonetheless realise that these are the scents of trees, and I think that's very important. I asked Ogawa Mitsuo, who is the current head carpenter of Horyuji Temple. He's the only apprentice of Nishioka Tsunekazu, the former head carpenter of the temple, and he's responsible for making repairs to the joinery and the woodwork in the temple. And I asked him if he could tell the difference between the woods that have been used. And he said no. And I even as this amazing head carpenter, he couldn't tell the difference. And I said, well, how do you know what woods to use then when you're working on the temple? And he said, even with 1,000-year-old woods, if you just shave the wood, you get the fragrance immediately. And that way he knows whether he's dealing with cypress or he's dealing with cedar.
Could you tell me some of the core aspects of daiku culture?
The secret to building buildings that last for a long time is understanding trees and knowing the characteristics of the trees and the wood. That's the most important thing, and then knowing how to make use of those different woods, and that is what's fundamental to the Japanese daiku culture. In daiku law, we say that you should use a tree the way it is found in nature. So trees grow straight, they have a top and a bottom, and using them in that same orientation is the way that material is going to last the longest. If you take a tree and cut it into boards that you then use horizontally as floorboards, the life of that material is going to be shortened. And I think that's quite an easy concept to grasp. If you go to Kyoto, you'll see a lot of the houses there have wooden boards on the outside walls. And if you look carefully, you can tell that they are in the direction that the tree was growing. The top is at the top, the bottom is at the bottom. But in a lot of other places in Japan, that isn't the case anymore. If you go to a timber merchant nowadays, quite often they don't know which end was the top and which end was the bottom of the tree. So a good daiku, a good Japanese carpenter will be able to distinguish, but a lot of them nowadays can't. These are the very basics of Japanese carpentry, but to go a little bit deeper, if you take trees, they grow in different places. So you have trees that grow near the top of a mountain, you have trees that grow down in the valley, and these will have different characteristics. If you take a tree that's grown near the top of a mountain, it will have been exposed to the sun from all directions, 360 degrees. The same with the wind. It will have been exposed to the wind from all different directions. And so in a lot of cases, that type of tree will be able to withstand force from any direction when it's used in construction. A tree that's grown lower down, on the other hand, will only have been exposed to sunlight from a particular direction, and the same with wind. So a tree that's grown lower down will have certain characteristics that mean maybe it's very strong when exposed to forces from one particular direction, but in the other direction it might bend very easily. And so that's something you have to take into account when choosing and using materials. This is what I've learned from head carpenter Nishioka, and so I've tried to incorporate this into the exhibition. I think these characteristics are unique to wood as a building material. You don't find this with concrete or with steel.
I wanted to ask a bit about the animistic beliefs and the view that trees are living entities. How does this belief inform the way in which timber is chosen and used?
Before I answer that question, I'd just like to add the fact that trees take a long time to grow, often longer than a human life. And when we're using a material that has taken a long time to form in the creation of a building, we have to bear in mind that it's going to take just as long to grow another tree to replace it. And so people think of wood as an environmentally friendly, recyclable material, but we still need to bear in mind the time that it takes to grow these trees. The exhibition starts with Japanese trees and Japanese forests. And Japanese forests, I think, are quite unique in the world because Japan is an island and surrounded by warm and cold currents that converge, which creates a unique climate and environment. And we have these trees, these Japanese cypress and cedar trees that live for thousands of years. And in Japan, we use these a lot as structural materials. And what head carpenter Nishioka of Horyuji, which has stood now for 1,300 years, said was that when Horyuji was built, the wood that was used was already 1,000 years old. And so the carpenters were doubtless, in their way, thanking the gods of the mountains for giving them these materials that would last at least as long again. I mentioned that Japanese forests are unusual, and I think the same can be said of the way that Japanese people feel about forests. I think if a Japanese person finds themselves alone in a forest, they're likely to feel afraid because of the overwhelming sense of being surrounded by nature and the realization of how small they themselves are. There is a sense of the eternal in the forests and of the unknown. And this is something I've tried to express in that forest section of the exhibition. The reason I say that this is probably an unusual way of thinking and feeling about forests is because if someone from a desert region were to find themselves in a forest, they would probably be delighted. I'm not sure about Europeans, but I mean, we all know that Europe used to be covered in abundant forests, which have now largely disappeared. And so for Europeans, maybe there's less a sense of the forests being an eternal presence and more a sense of them being a limited resource, which is why I say that the Japanese people have a unique sensibility when it comes to forests, and I hope that comes across in the exhibition. I also think that maybe this is at the root of the Japanese religion and the idea of spirit deities, of kami, in all things and in all of nature.
そのことがいろんな神様が日本にいる元になるんだというふうに考えています。
Marcelo Nishiyama, curator, and his translator there was Bethan Jones. The Craft of Carpentry, Drawing Life from Japanese Forests, is on at the Japan House, London, until the 6th of July 2025. And to close today's show, Nick, you spoke to Mirkku Kullberg. She's the CEO of the Swedish rug company Kasthall. What more can you tell me about Mirkku?
This was part of a bigger profile for Monocle magazine's March issue, looking at rug makers across the globe. You can pick up a copy of that on our website or on newsstands. We've touched already on this show, but we kind of did a little bit of a deep dive into various companies that are designing and making in one place. Because I think it's very common at the moment to have a rug company design in, say, London and then manufacture in Morocco. And we kind of wanted to look at companies that were much more joined up in their production. And Kasthall is one of the leading firms doing this. They're based in Kinna, which is about an hour's drive southeast of Gothenburg in Sweden. And they're celebrating their 136th anniversary this year. Mirkku, who we're going to hear from, has just been brought in as the CEO. So she's coming at this, I think, this really interesting time for the global rug market. There's this new kind of emphasis on quality and I think an appreciation for the role that a rug and floor coverings can play in our home. And so Mirkku told us a little bit about this, and we talked about material innovation and the evolution of Kasthall's identity.
I think that this fascinating idea that it's a material which is very crafted because it's the wool, the whole the spinning and the dyeing and everything, this whole like a science around the dyeing and getting the right colors and everything. We are doing like over 7,000-8,000 rugs per year, which is it's a pretty big amount as well. So it's kind of like 200 rugs are going almost through the production, and they are qualitatively is super even.
For rug companies based in Europe, maybe there's a temptation to outsource to Asia where it can be cheaper to produce. But what you're saying is that this desire for designers to be hands-on and near the production is part of the appeal of continuing to make in Sweden for Kasthall, where it might be a little bit more expensive.
If we think what happened during the pandemic time, what was the most vulnerable thing was the logistics. And I think that will remain the case. We never knew what's going to happen in the future. There will be coming regulations. The closer you can actually act on a market, which obviously Nordic has been the biggest market for Kasthall, and now we're working with Europe, I would still think it started to be an incredible benefit to be able to have it locally. And if you have a machinery, so you are not having that much, the labor is more like a kind of working on the machinery and working the finishing and doing these things. Actually, the balance is very good in that sense. Even in the pricing. If I think that one day maybe we would be having somewhere in South America, it's this kind of production which would be directed to the US market. So I think it's a very continental thing as to today's world, also the production.
I'm also curious where there's innovation in terms of design, because in my mind, it's not like the form of a rug can change dramatically. So what can we do? Get me excited about rug design.
What we think is actually what we are now launching as well is we have been working as an innovation perspective. It's the materials, obviously, and it will be also the treatments. I think there will be coming in nanotechnology for the new treatments, how so you can increase the kind of how you clean them and keep them clean. But we are currently working with a post-consumer wool, which is not anything like it's happening already in fashion in many ways. We are actually releasing a collection that's designed by David Chipperfield, and it's done in post-consumer wool. Even the fibers are shorter, and it has not been that easy to get the yarn done. But the idea is that from hospitality industry, like filling materials, beds or something, the filling materials, we can actually do a new yarn, which is a kind of reusing that program. So one thing is definitely how you recycle that. I think that its innovation is always related to technology or material technology, but I think that how can to bring and thinking how the rug can be more than just a part of the floor, but could it be like a sort of that there's a composition way of thinking how to work with rugs.
If we're looking at Kasthall's rugs, and our listeners can do so in your showrooms and online, you work with this amazing roster of designers, including the likes of Cecily Benson. But I'm curious to learn about the skill set and the stories behind these designs. It looks like there's a material narrative in your work, but there's also something about the way that these rugs are assembled, a production narrative perhaps. Is this something that you've built into your factory in Kinna over the last 135 years?
Yes, and I think that there are two product specialists. One is specialist in weaving, and the other one is specialist in tufting. They have been in the company since they were youngsters. So now they are I think that the other one had his 50th birthday was actually yesterday. So he says that he has been there 25 years or 30 years or whatever. That kind of workmanship and skills, it has never disappeared. And even they have been able to push it further. And Cecil Munch had really challenged them to look at differently. She even did some weaving tests at her own studio in Copenhagen. And these guys, they're incredible how they can realize. I found and the skills have been there. So I found we were looking at the archives. One of this guy who has actually Kasthall tattoo on his hand he knows everything about that. He's so funny. I went to see the archives. He was showing me a tufted rug, which was a portrait. The skill, and I asked him, could you still do that? And he would say, yeah, we could still do this. The knowledge is there, how to treat the machine, how to treat the material, combine the technology, certain kind of old classical techniques in a modern contemporary way.
As we're looking to wrap this up, I have to ask the obvious question. What sets Kasthall apart? What makes this firm so special?
What sets Kasthall apart is a kind of company which can be a rug company, it can be a carpet company, but I think it can be the most important rug company in the world by just knowing that it has the skill set and the machinery, and it has a kind of the knowledge which is kind of with the archives and with the people from generation to generation want to take it further. It's all about people eventually at the end.
Mirkku Kullberg there, CEO of Kasthall, and for the full rug report, pick up a copy of Monocle magazine's March issue, which is available on all good newsstands now. Mei Lee, that's all for today's show. Thank you very much for joining me on this side of the glass.
You're very welcome.
For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then do pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was produced and edited by Mei Lee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.